Our first speaker this morning is Marianne Stam from the California Department of Justice, the Riverside Crime Lab. She is a supervisory chemist, and one of the many areas she supervises is trace evidence. So, Marianne?
Thank you, Chris. Is this on? Thank you, Chris. Okay, today I'm going to present a study that I did kind of quick and dirty on forensic geosciences, comparing the types of methods used, who's doing forensic soils, and kind of like what affiliation the authors were with in some of the studies I looked at. This was also in cooperation with Raymond Murray, and I don't know if you know Raymond Murray, but he's sort of the guru and god of forensic geoscience. Okay, my premise was I wanted to look at the forensic geosciences because I was noticing that in the UK, the forensic geosciences were really enjoying a renaissance in the decades of the 2000s. But in the United States, we were pretty much stagnant. And so today, that's my premise. I wanted to present how I did that, the notable trends that support my concept, and the possible reasons for the differences. And then I'll give two examples that show the different approaches in geoscience cases in the UK and the United States. So my study approach was to look at literature searches that I did of forensic geoscience articles and books that dealt pretty much strictly with soil. I excluded anything that had to do with sites on, burial sites or palynology or diatoms. I just wanted to look at how soils were looked at by various authors, what methods they used, and so on. So to start my study, I went to the California Criminalistics Institute and did a library search. Now, this study was done in 2008, so I looked at literature from about 1975 to the present. And the California Criminalistics Institute sent me a bibliography back, separated by year, and I was able to, and I wanted to look at forensic science literature. So I looked at the Journal of Forensic Sciences, the Journal of Forensic Science Society, which later became Science and Justice, from 1973 to the present, Forensic Science International articles. I used Pye and Croft also to look up articles in that book, which was sort of the first book that came out of one of the first forensic geoscience gatherings in London in 2004. And then I looked at Kenneth Pye's general book on geological and soil evidence forensic applications from 2007 to get more papers to look at. The notable trends that I found in the past 8 years, the UK authors have published many more papers and books on forensic geoscience than those in the US. Of the published articles, the authors in the UK are affiliated more with private companies or academic institutions, whereas authors in the US were with the academic or government institutions. Government institutions meaning crime laboratories, largely. In some instances, there may have been government-funded private institutions that did work. The methods of analysis I looked at and the measured soil properties, and they were more traditional, as we would term it, in the US than in the UK, and more sophisticated methods of analyses, and also more sophisticated measured soil properties were looked at by authors from private or academic institutions in general. So this is my first graph, which shows forensic geoscience articles in forensic science publications from the 70s to the present. And if you look at the purple, it's the Journal of Forensic Science articles. If you look at the white, it's Science and Justice or Forensic Science International. And if you look at the blue, which there's only one, and it's supposed to be blue right there, that's the Canadian Journal of Forensic Science. Now for UK, I defined it as not only the United Kingdom, England, and its associate regions, but also Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. So I looked at the affiliates of the UK as well. So if you notice, from the 1970s through the 90s, pretty much the published literature stayed stable in all regions. But if you look at the 2000s, it just took off in the UK, with UK authors, or at least in articles in Science and Justice and Forensic Science International. So then I looked at authors' affiliations. Were they with academic institutions? Were they with government? Were they government plus academic? Were they a private institution like Macaulay Institute in Scotland? Or were they private plus academic? So the white on the screen is the US, and the red is the UK. So one of the trends to note is that much of the authors' affiliations are private institutions for the UK, and the US has none in private plus academic or private. And most of ours are academic institutions and government-affiliated laboratory publications. Then I looked at the measured soil properties. And from your left to the right, it's going from the more traditional methods up through more sophisticated methods, as I called it. If you look, this graph is heavy for the UK on the right-hand side, which includes major and trace element, heavy metal analyses, properties were looked at, isotope ratios, and also the development of soil databases. If you look at the US, we have a lot of organic components being looked at, and that's, I'll show you later, it's affiliated with academic institutions. But other than that, we're pretty much heavy on this side of the graph, which is the more traditional methods of analyzing soils. Then I looked at the analytical methods that were used to measure these soil properties. And again, to your left, you'll see the optical microscopy. Microscopy in general includes PLM and stereo microscopy, which is one of the more traditional methods. And as you go to the right, you'll see some of the more modern methods or different methods that have been applied more recently. And again, the UK in the red is pretty heavy over here. The US, the only place that the US has some data has been published on DNA, but mostly this section is dominated by UK and its affiliates, whereas over here, we're largely dominated using some of the more common methods of analyses. So then I looked at the percent frequency of measured soil properties in the published forensic geoscience literature by affiliation. And this is for UK and its affiliates. Database, and if you look, blue is private, yellow is government, green is academic, and white is private plus academic, and red is government plus academic. And if you go up to this part of the graph where it talks about databases, isotope ratios, major and trace element heavy metals, you will see that private institutions or private companies have pretty much dominated that area, versus down here where you have size, shape, texture, color, particle size, density gradients, bulk mineralogy, you have both government and government plus academic being the affiliations for the papers. So again, you see the more traditional methods being dominated by government and academic affiliates, or academic, some private, but mostly the government and academic, versus the databases, isotope ratios, major trace element, and heavy metals being dominated by private companies or institutions. In the US, we have nothing that I've seen published on databases or isotope ratios, and this is in the forensic literature. We have a lot that's been published on organic components, and that's all affiliated with academic plus some government. And then we're pretty much heavy down at the lower levels of clay mineralogy, bulk mineralogy, density, color, and that's all with government laboratories. So what were some of the reasons for this? And these thoughts came from Raymond Murray largely, and he was, in 1991, he gave me the history that the Forensic Science Service began selling services in the agency. In 2005, it actually became a government company. At that point, many of the scientists left to open private labs. Academics became major providers of forensic data. University instrumentation became available. We had competition among providers for lower costs. We had research at former government labs decreased. We had quality control issues became a major issue because a lot of the private companies that started up were started by non-forensic practitioners, and they had some problems with quality control, not knowing about some of the issues involved with forensic samples that, they didn't bother to investigate what they should have, as did Gwyneth in her presentation. Being an academic, she seemed to have researched what some of the issues with forensic samples are. So at one point, they had quality control issues with some of these private laboratories. And then academic and private labs began to actively publish a lot of forensic-related articles and books. They started to have conferences, and so that's how this worked. In 2010, the Forensic Science Service closed. So that was something that occurred just recently. So here's the case examples that I was going to provide. This is a case that I did out of San Diego for San Diego County Sheriff's Department, and it involved a suspect named Bennett Douglas. He was charged with the murder of two female acquaintances. He allegedly killed his victims and buried them in different places in northern San Diego County, California. Both of these sites are within the Peninsular Range batholith, and both sites were within 5 miles of each other. And these are geomorphic provinces in California. Peninsular ranges are right down here. San Diego's down in here. Riverside somewhere up in here where I'm from, and LA is sitting in more to the west. So the first body was found in a creek called Reedy Creek, and it was found amongst pretty much stuffed in where there's a lot of plants and soil. The second body was found in a citrus grove next to a cultivated, a landscaped park called Mountain View Park. So there was some evidence in this case that were submitted to the laboratory. There were 2 shovels and a hoe. They all had adhering soil, and they were found in the suspect's garage. These, along with soil samples from burial sites, were submitted to the lab for analysis. There were also sites from the suspect's residence that were submitted as well, but and they were not similar to the soil from the sites, the burial sites. But I'm not going to discuss those in detail. So here's the shovel, and if you look down in this area, you see regions of nice adhering soil. This is the hoe, and it had very light-colored sort of clay-sized, fine-grained, yellowish soil on it. So I examined the samples for color, particle size, distribution, and mineralogy. Very simple analyses that we could do on the cheap in the laboratory. I looked at the whole samples and the sieve samples for color and grain morphology. I then took the 90 to 180 micron fraction. I looked at the whole fraction mounted under the PLM for mineralogy. I looked at the light minerals that I separated out from the heavy minerals, and again looked at their mineralogy and at the heavy minerals. These were the examination techniques: stereo microscopy, polarizing light microscopy, X-ray diffraction. I went to the local university and had them run the samples on their instrument because we don't have that instrument available to us. The results: the soil from the Hoe differed in color and aggregate morphology than the soils from either burial site. The soil from both shovels that were submitted had different color and grain sizes in their soils, and aggregate morphology was different, and plant material was different from Reedy Creek burial site. Now that was fortuitous in a sense that Reedy Creek actually had other evidence that connected the victim at Reedy Creek with the suspect, and Gene Lawrence worked on that evidence. So they were really looking to see if they could tie it in to the Mountain View Park site. Well, soil on one shovel was similar in color, particle, size distribution, and mineralogy to the Mountain View Park burial site. Soil on the other shovel was similar in most features, but it did have fewer zircons than that at Mountain View Park. X-ray diffraction results confirmed the microscopy data. And I should add one more thing. The suspect wrote a note in prison backwards. You know, he wrote it backwards to make it look like code. And he said, "Get rid of the shovels," on the note. So that was a big key in the case. Anyway, in the UK case, it involved a suspect named Robert Young. He was a Northern Ireland loyalist, paramilitary gang member, and drug dealer, and he was convicted of murder in 2005. In this particular case, although they weren't looking at geological soil samples, they were looking at geologically related building materials. And this showed the use of QuemScan, which is basically an automated SEM fitted with 4 energy dispersive X-ray spectrometers, and it's important in providing crucial analytical data that led to the conviction of Mr. Young. The QuemScan, as I understand it, has automated search capabilities too, where it's kind of like GSR. It will search by shape, and so it's automated as far as picking out different types of grains to look at. So Young was suspected of being one of 2 gunmen who shot and killed a rival gang member. During the escape of these gunmen, they ran through a yard containing waste materials that had plasterboard. Young was apprehended, his car was seized and searched, and they found small amounts of plasterboard on the floorboard. They identified gypsum using X-ray diffraction in the plasterboard from the car and from the yard along the escape route. But, you know, is all gypsum the same? So what they then analyzed it using QuemScan and showed the samples had similar chemical compositions from Young's car and that from the escape route, including minor and trace elements and similar textural features. So in order to determine, well, are all, you know, plasterboards the same and the gypsum the same, they went out and sampled different 4 commercially available plasterboards and tested these with QuemScan. And these samples all differed in minor and trace elements and textural features from the gypsum in Young's car and from the yard. This work was done, I believe, by Alistair Ruffle from Northern Ireland, and also Duncan Peary, who has the QuemScan instrument. So ultimately, my study conclusions, including these case examples, shows that privatization of forensic labs in the UK has increased cooperation between academic institutions and forensic community. It's increased the number of institutions, both private and academic, who are interested in pursuing forensic geoscience research. It's allowed for more funding and time to pursue research in academic settings that have more research-oriented resources available. But however, it has led to some quality control issues of work products. In forensic labs in the United States, we face different challenges. And these challenges have precluded the development of forensic geosciences in general. For example, we're dependent on public funds, which can vary from year to year, and much of the literature that's come out on forensic soils in the US has been from government-run crime laboratories. We have a concentration of limited monetary and workload resources on DNA analysis and databases. There's been trace evidence sections being closed down and consolidated. There's been crime labs inundated with casework and not having enough analysts to do the casework. So basically, this graph just shows how the UK has developed strong ties to academics, strong ties to private laboratories, forensic laboratories, strong ties to private and government-funded institutions, and of course their tie to government-run forensic labs has been broken because the forensic science laboratories, government-run, had closed down. In the US, we have weak ties to academics, weak ties to private forensic laboratories in some cases. We have very weak ties to private and government-funded institutions, and we have very strong ties to government-run forensic labs. And now for something completely different, which you can't read, but I wanted to go on and present some recent developments in forensic soils. In 2010, the third International Soil Forensics Conference was held in Long Beach, California. And the other recent development is the International Union of Geological Sciences Initiative. First, the 2010 Long Beach Soil Conference. There were 12 nations represented, including delegates from as far away as Australia and as exotic places as United Arab Emirates, with Europeans, Canadians, of course, people from the US, and contingent from the United Kingdom. Presentation highlights ranged from the Forensic Geosciences and the NAS report and consequences of the NAS report on forensic geoscience, to QuemScan, to locating buried bodies via chemical processes, to case studies and historical perspectives, and provenance studies as well. Now, there's also another development here, and that's with Swig Geo, Scientific Working Group for Forensic Geoscience. The facilitators are Chris Taylor and Bill Schneck. And the first formal gathering, or informal gathering, was a luncheon at the 2010 Forensics Conference in Long Beach. On to the IUGS, which is the International Union of Geological Sciences. This is a non-governmental scientific organization that supports and facilitates international and interdisciplinary cooperation in geology. Recently, forensic geology as a subdiscipline just attained the initiative status. This is the highest level for an international working group affiliate of the IUGS. It provides forensic geology with global status and with some funding. And the IFG was established in 2011 due to the efforts of Lawrence Donnelly of the United Kingdom. These are some of the officers that are on the committee and or officers of the IFG. And You can see that we have various people from the UK, Australia, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the US as the immediate officers. Then we have regional officers that include representatives from the Middle East, Europe, Africa, Canada, Latin America, Russia, Australia, and Pacific, USA, and Japan, and Asia. The prospective goals and objectives of the IFG are to promote forensic geology around the world, provide forensic geology training, outreach, and dissemination of forensic geology-related information worldwide, and establish best practices and guidelines. And the website is listed at the bottom here. And the website was set up by Elise Bergleisen from Buffalo. The upcoming events in forensic geology, there's a lot. In 2011, we're going to meet in Rome for the inaugural meeting of the IUGS Forensic Geology Initiative. There's going to be a meeting of the International Geological Congress in Brisbane, Australia, 4th International Conference on Criminal and Environmental Soil Forensics in the Netherlands, and the Forensic Soils Workshop at the American Academy meeting in Atlanta. And that's it.